Welcome to Math with Mr. J. In this video, I'm going to go through an introductory mini course, so to speak, on rational numbers and number lines. We will go through identifying, graphing, comparing, and ordering rational numbers using number lines. This will give us a pretty solid base and understanding of rational numbers on number lines that we can build off of. We will start with identifying rational numbers on a number line, move to graphing rational numbers on a number line, then take a look at comparing rational numbers using a number line, and then end with ordering rational numbers using a number line. Now remember, rational numbers are numbers that can be written as a fraction of two integers. The decimal form either terminates or repeats. If you need more help with what rational numbers are, I have a video covering this. That link is in the description. Now, for this section, we have two number lines with rational numbers graphed on them. We need to identify, we need to figure out what those numbers are. Let's jump into our examples, starting with numbers 1 through 5. Looking at this number line, and any number line really, we need to understand that if we look at 0, we have positives to the right and negatives to the left. So starting at 0, positives to the right, negatives to the left. Now as far as moving along a number line, moving right or up a number line, we increase in value. Moving to the left or down a number line, we decrease in value. Now, before we jump into number 1, we need to figure out what we're working with as far as how this number line is presented. Well, the lowest number in value shown on the number line is -3, and then the highest value shown on the number line is +3. In between each number, the number line is split into 4 sections, fourths. So this number line is showing fourths. So if we look at 0 and we go right, we have 1/4, 2/4, which is 1/2, 3/4, 1, 1 and 1/4, 1 and a half, 1 and 3/4, 2, and so on. And if we look at 0 and go left, we have -1/4, -2/4, which is -1/2, -3/4, -1, -1 and 1/4, -1 and a half, -1 and 3/4, -2, and so on. Looking at number 1, we have point A. So where is point A on the number line? Well, point A is right here, and it is at -2. So point A is at -2 on the number line. Next, we have point B, which is right here. So B is in between 0 and 1. We have 1/4, 2/4, or 1/2, and then 3/4. So point B is at 1/4 on the number line. Now, I do want to mention fractions can be written as decimals, and decimals can be written as fractions. So it's good to be familiar with both. And fourths are common, so knowing the fractional and decimal forms will be helpful. I have some notes in the corner right here for this. 1/4 equals 25 hundredths. 2/4, which is 1/2, equals 5/10, and then 3/4 equals 75 hundredths. And if you're wondering why 1/2 only goes to the tenths place, why we only have 5/10 there, well, we can write it as 0.50, so 50 hundredths, but remember, zeros to the right of a decimal are not needed, so we can just write it as 5/10. So let's write 1/4 in decimal form as well. So this is 25 hundredths. Let's move on to number 3, where we have point C, which is right here. Point C is between 1 and 2. So this is 1 and 1/4, 1 and a half, and then 1 and 3/4. So point C is at 1 and 3/4 on the number line, which as a decimal is 1 decimal 75. So 1 and 75 hundredths. Next, we have point D, which is right here between -2 and -3. So we have -2 and 1/4, -2 and 2/4, which is -2 and a half, and then -2 and 3/4. So point D is at -2 and a half on the number line, which in decimal form is -2.5. So -2 and 5 tenths. And then we can wrap up this first number line with number 5. We have point E, which is right here. And we are in between 0 and -1. We have -1/4, -2/4, or -1/2, and then -3/4. So point E is at -3/4 on the number line. Written as a decimal, we have -0.75. So -75 hundredths. Let's move on to numbers 6 through 10, where we will be working with a different number line. So starting at 0 and going to the right, it looks like we have fifths here. So we have 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, 1, and then so on. Moving to the left, we have -1/5, -2/5, -3/5, -4/5, -1, and so on. So looking at number 6, we have point V, which is right here. Point V is at 0 on the number line. Moving on to number 7, we have point W, which is right here. Point W is in between 0 and -1. We have -1/5, -2/5, -3/5, -4/5, and then -1. So point W is at -2/5 on the number line. And then as far as fifths, here are the decimal forms. So -2/5 is -4/10. Moving on to number 8, we have point X, which is right here. So point X is in between 1 and 2. We have 1 and 1/5, 1 and 2/5, 1 and 3/5, and then 1 and 4/5. So point X is at 1 and 4/5 on the number line, which in decimal form is 1.8. So 1 and 8 tenths. Next, for number 9, we have point Y, which is right here. So again, we are between 1 and 2. So this is at 1 and 1/5. So 1 and 1/5 for point Y. And in decimal form, this equals 1.2. So 1 and 2 tenths. And then lastly, point Z is right here in between -1 and -2. So this is -1 and 1/5, -1 and 2/5, -1 and 3/5, and then -1 and 4/5. So point Z is at -1 and 3/5 on the number line, which equals -1.6. So -1 and 6 tenths in decimal form. So there's how to identify rational numbers on a number line. Let's move on to graphing rational numbers on a number line. Here are our examples for graphing rational numbers on a number line. Let's jump into numbers 1 through 5. As far as our first number line here, we have fourths represented on the number line, just like number 1 from the first section. Now let's look at number 1. We have -3. So we need to graph -3, which is going to be to the left of 0. -3 is right here. So this is -3. Next, for number 2, we have 1/2, which is positive, so we are going to be to the right of 0. 1/2 is going to be in between 0 and 1. We have 1/4, 2/4, which is 1/2, and then 3/4. So this is 1/2 right here. Moving on to number 3, we have -1 and 3/4. So we need to look in between -1 and -2. We are to the left of 0 here. So looking in between -1 and -2, we have -1 and 1/4, -1 and 2/4, or -1 and a half, and then -1 and 3/4. So -1 and 3/4 is right here. Moving on to number 4, we have 2 and 75 hundredths. This is in decimal form. Now, fractions can be written as decimals, and decimals can be written as fractions. So we need to know both, and fourths are common. So knowing the fractional and decimal forms will be helpful. I have some notes to the right that will help us with this. So 0.75 75 hundredths, that equals 3/4 in fractional form. So this is 2 and 3/4 in fractional form. So let's graph 2 and 75 hundredths, or 2 and 3/4. That's positive, so we are going to be to the right of 0, and this is going to be in between 2 and 3. So looking in between 2 and 3, we have 2 and 1/4, 2 and 2/4, 2.5, and then 2 and 3/4. So 2 and 3/4, 2 and 75 hundredths is right here. And I'll write it in decimal form since it was originally in decimal form. Moving on to number 5, we have -25 hundredths, which equals -1/4 in fractional form. So we can use this right here. Now, -1/4 is going to be to the left of 0 and in between 0 and -1. We have -1/4, then -2/4, so -1/2, and then -3/4. So -1/4, or -25 hundredths, is right here. And I will write this in decimal form. Let's move on to numbers 6 through 10, and we are going to be working with a different number line here. And this number line is split into halves. So as far as positives, we have 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and so on. And then as far as negatives, we have -1/2, -1, -1.5, -2, -2.5, and so on. Now, taking a look at number 6, we have 2 and 3/10. Now, this is not exactly on a half, so we will need to estimate, and we can get this pretty close. So again, this isn't going to be graphed exactly on a half. We have to use what we are given and what we know to estimate and get this as close as possible. Now, 2 and 3/10 equals 2 and 3/10 in fractional form. We can see that this is going to be in between 2 and 3. Now let's look at 2 and a half. Is 2 and 3/10 less than 2.5 or greater than 2.5? Well, we know that 2.5 equals 2 and 5/10. Those are equivalent. And since we are comparing tenths here, we know that 3/10 is going to be less than 5/10. 2 and 3/10 is less than 2.5. So we know that 2 and 3/10 will be between 2 and 2.5. So we can estimate and get it close. It's going to be about right here. So this is 2 and 3/10. So sometimes we may have something we need to graph that isn't exactly on the number line. Again, use what we are given, use what we know to estimate and get it as close as possible. Let's do another one like this and move on to number 7. We have -4 and 9 tenths, which written as a fraction is going to be -4 and 9 tenths. So this will not be exactly on a half, but we know that this will be left of 0 and it will be in between -4 and -5. But let's narrow this down and look at -4 and 1/2. Now, is -4 and 9 tenths greater than -4 and 1/2 or less than -4 and 1/2? So is it going to be greater than and closer to -4 or less than and closer to -5? Well, -4 and 9 tenths is less than -4 and 1/2. It's closer to -5 than it is to -4. So this is going to be in between -4 and 1/2 and -5. And -4 and 9 tenths is pretty close to -5. It's only 1/10 away, so we will put it right here. So this is -4 and 9 tenths. Next, let's move on to number 8. We have -1 and 5 tenths, which is -1 and 1/2. 5 tenths is equal to a half. And we can write this in fractional form as well, -1 and 1/2. So this will be to the left of 0 and in between -1 and -2. And this does land on the half. So this is -1 and 1/2. -1 and 5 tenths in decimal form. Moving on to number 9, we have 9/2, 9/2. This is an improper fraction. Let's convert it to a mixed number to make it a little easier to graph. We do that by dividing the numerator, the top number, by the denominator, the bottom number. So 9 divided by 2. How many whole groups of 2 in 9? Well, 4. That gets us to 8. So we have a remainder of 1, and then we keep the denominator of 2 the same. So 9/2 equals 4 and 1/2 as a mixed number. So let's graph 4 and 1/2. So this is going to be to the right of 0 and in between 4 and 5. It lands on the half. So this is 4 and 1/2 right here. And we will write the original improper fraction, 9/2. Now, another way to do this one, since our denominator is 2 here, we are working with halves, we can count off 9 halves. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we land in the same spot. Lastly, for number 10, we have -25/8. So -25/8, which is another improper fraction. So let's convert it to a mixed number. And again, we do that by dividing the numerator, -25, by the denominator, 8. So we have a negative divided by a positive. That's going to give us a negative. So -25 divided by 8, well, we get -3 and 1/8. Now let's take a look at graphing this on the number line. Now, -3 and 1/8 is not going to be exactly on a half, so we need to estimate. Now we know this will be left of 0, to the left of 0. It's negative. And then it's going to be in between -3 and -4. And then to narrow this down even further, let's look at -3 and 1/2. So is this greater than -3 and 1/2 and closer to -3, or less than -3 and 1/2 and closer to -4? Well, -3 and 1/8 is greater than -3 and 1/2. So it's going to be in between -3 and -3 and a half. -3 and 1/8 is closer to -3 than it is to -4. So let's put -3 and 1/8 right here. It's really close to -3. It's only 1/8 away. And I will write the original improper fraction. So -25/8. So there's how to graph rational numbers on a number line. Let's move on to comparing. Here are our examples for comparing rational numbers using a number line. Now remember, when it comes to number lines, if we look at 0, positive numbers are to the right of 0 and negative numbers are to the left of 0. And keep in mind, as far as moving along a number line, numbers increase in value as we move to the right and decrease in value as we move to the left. So when we compare rational numbers using a number line, the number further to the right on the number line will be greater in value. Let's jump into number 1, where we have a very simple comparison. Is 2 greater than, less than, or equal to 4? Well, obviously 2 is less than 4. But I wanted to start very simple because we're going to build off of this, and this leads into number 2, where we have negatives. So as far as the number line, 2 is right here, and 4 is right here. 4 is greater than 2. It's further right on the number line. So 2 is less than 4. Let's move on to number 2, where we have -2 is greater than, less than, or equal to -4. Well, -2 is right here on the number line, and -4 is right here. So which number is further to the right and therefore greater in value? Well, -2. -2 is greater than -4. At first glance, -4 may seem greater because 4 is greater than 2, but we have to think we are working with negatives here. -2 is further right on the number line. It's greater in value. So -2 is greater than -4. Moving on to number 3, we have 6 and 3/4 is greater than, less than, or equal to 6 and 5/10. So we have a number in fractional form and a number in decimal form. Remember, fractions can be written as decimals, and decimals can be written as fractions. So when we compare rational numbers, it's always a good idea to have the numbers in the same form. So either both in fractional form or both in decimal form. This will make it easier to compare. For number 3, let's put 6 and 5/10 in fractional form. 6 and 5/10 is 6 and a half. Anytime you have 0.5, 5/10, that's a half. And that always works out to be a half because 0.5, 5/10 in fractional form is 5/10, which we can simplify. The greatest common factor between 5 and 10 is 5. So let's divide our numerator and denominator by 5 in order to simplify. 5 divided by 5 is 1, and 10 divided by 5 is 2. So 5/10, 0.5 equals 1/2. Now, as far as the number line, both of these numbers are between 6 and 7. Let's start with 6 and 3/4. This is 6 and 1/4, 6 and 2/4, which is 6 and a half, and then 6 and 3/4. So 6 and 3/4 is right here. And then we have 6 and 5/10, which is 6 and a half. That's right here. And I'll write the original decimal form. So we can see that 6 and 3/4 is further to the right on the number line, therefore greater in value. So 6 and 3/4 is greater than 6 and 5/10. Next, let's move on to number 4. We have 3 is greater than, less than, or equal to 17 fifths. 3 is right here on the number line. And then 17 fifths, 17 over 5, that's an improper fraction. So we need to convert it to a mixed number. That will make this much simpler to put on the number line and compare. So to convert this to a mixed number, let's do it underneath here. We need to divide the numerator 17 by the denominator 5. So how many whole groups of 5 in 17? Well, 3. That's going to be the whole number of our mixed number. That gets us to 15. So we have a remainder of 2. That's the numerator of the fractional part. And then we keep the denominator of 5 the same. So 17 fifths equals 3 and 2 fifths as a mixed number. 3 and 2 fifths is greater than 3, but less than 3 and a half. 3 and 2 fifths is about right here. And I'll write the original improper fraction. So 3 and 2 fifths, 17 fifths, is greater than 3. It's further right on the number line. So looking at the comparison, 3 is less than 17 fifths. Moving on to number 5, we have negative 25 hundredths is greater than, less than, or equal to 9 tenths. Now here we are comparing a negative to a positive. So the positive is automatically going to be greater. But let's put these on the number line to show that. And remember, it's helpful to have both numbers in the same form. So let's do decimal form for this one. 9 tenths in fractional form, so 9 over 10, is written like this in decimal form. As far as the number line, negative 25 hundredths is going to be to the left of 0. It's negative. And in between 0 and negative 5 tenths, negative 1 half. Now, negative 25 hundredths is negative 1/4. So it is about right here, right in between 0 and negative 5 tenths. So negative 25 hundredths, which again is negative 1/4. And then 9 tenths is to the right of 0 and in between 5 tenths and 1. 9 tenths is pretty close to 1. It's only 1/10 away. So let's put 9 tenths right here, and I'll write it in the original fractional form. So we can see that 9 tenths is further right on the number line and therefore greater in value. So as far as the comparison, negative 25 hundredths is less than 9 tenths. Lastly, let's move on to number 6, where we have negative 8 and 7 tenths is greater than, less than, or equal to negative 8 and 85 hundredths. Now, both of these numbers are in between negative 8 and negative 9. As far as the number line, negative 8 and 7 tenths will be, well, we have negative 8 and 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, which is negative 8 and a half, 6 tenths, and 7 tenths. So negative 8 and 7 tenths is right here. And then negative 8 and 85 hundredths, this will be right in between negative 8 and 8 tenths and negative 8 and 9 tenths. Negative 8 and 8 tenths is right here. And negative 8 and 9 tenths is right here. And if we write a 0 in the hundredths place for both of these, so hundredths place, and remember, we can write zeros to the right of a decimal. That doesn't change the value, so these are equivalent. And that will help us place 8 and 85 hundredths, because that goes to the hundredths place. And now those decimals do as well. And we know that 85 is in between 80 and 90. So negative 8 and 85 hundredths is about right here. Negative 8 and 7 tenths is further to the right on the number line. It's greater in value. So negative 8 and 7 tenths is greater than negative 8 and 85 hundredths. So there's how to compare rational numbers using a number line. Let's move on to ordering. Here are our examples for ordering rational numbers using a number line. We will do one example where we go least to greatest and one where we go greatest to least. So when we order rational numbers using a number line, the number furthest to the left will be the least and the number furthest to the right will be the greatest. Let's jump into number 1, where we have 1 and 4 tenths, negative 2 and 3 fifths, 0, 9 fourths, and negative 1 and 5 tenths. Let's start with 1 and 4 tenths. Well, 1 and 4 tenths is just 1 tenth less than 1 and 5 tenths, 1 and a half. So let's put 1 and 4 tenths right here. Next, we have negative 2 and 3 fifths. So we have a mixed number involving a fraction. Now we can place this as is, as a fraction, but it's helpful to have everything in the same form. So everything in fractional form or everything in decimal form. Remember, fractions can be written as decimals and decimals can be written as fractions. Let's write this in decimal form along with any other fractions since the number line has decimals. Now, negative 2 and 3 fifths equals negative 2 and 6 tenths as a decimal. We divide the numerator 3 by the denominator 5 to get that fraction to a decimal. So top divided by bottom, 3 divided by 5. If you need more help with converting fractions to decimals, check the description for a link to my video on that. Now, as far as the number line, negative 2 and 6 tenths is to the left of 0. It's negative. Negative 2 and 6 tenths is less than negative 2 and 5 tenths. So it's going to be to the left, and it's only 1 tenth less. So it's pretty close. Let's put negative 2 and 6 tenths right here. And let's write this in the original fractional form. So negative 2 and 3 fifths. Again, in decimal form, negative 2 and 6 tenths. Moving on, we have 0, which is right here. After 0, we have 9 fourths, which is an improper fraction. Let's convert it to a mixed number by dividing the numerator 9 by the denominator 4. So how many whole groups of 4 in 9? And let's do this to the side here. So how many whole groups of 4 in 9? Well, 2. That's our whole number of the mixed number. That gets us to 8. So we have a remainder of 1. That's the numerator of the fractional part. And then we keep the denominator of 4 the same. So 2 and 1 fourth. So this is 2 and 1 fourth. Let's write this as a decimal. Well, 1 fourth is 0.25, 25 hundredths as a decimal. So this is 2 decimal 25. So 2 and 25 hundredths. Now, as far as the number line, 2 and 25 hundredths is going to be in between 2 and 5 tenths. So let's place 2 and 25 hundredths right here, or 2 and 1 fourth, and we will write the original improper fraction. And then lastly, we have negative 1 and 5 tenths, which is negative 1 and a half. This is between negative 1 and negative 2. We are to the left of 0 here. We have a negative. So negative 1 and 5 tenths is right here. Now that everything is on the number line, we can order these from least to greatest. The number furthest to the left on the number line is the least, the lowest in value. And then we can work our way right. So negative 2 and 3/5 is the least. Then we have negative 1 and 5/10, then 0, then 1 and 4/10, and then the greatest is 9/4. Now, as I wrote those rational numbers in order, I wrote the original form of everything. Let's move on to number 2, where we have negative 3 and 9/10, 4, 3/8, negative 2, 3 and 75 hundredths, negative 15 thirds, and then 1 and 7/12. And for this number line, we don't have the halves marked, so this is a little bit of a different look. We will start with negative 3/9. Now remember, it can be helpful to have everything in the same form, either decimal or fractional. Some situations may work better with all fractions and some with all decimals. And if we are given a number line showing decimals or a number line showing fractions, it may be a good idea to change according to that. So, really, there are a number of possibilities that we need to be prepared for. So, keep in mind, we can always change to all decimals or all fractions if necessary. It can make it easier to compare and order. So, for number 2, let's do fractional form for any decimals to show what that looks like. So, negative 3 and 9/10, negative 3.9, looks like this in fractional form, so 9/10. As far as the number line, this is negative, so we are to the left of 0, and it's going to be in between negative 3 and negative 4. Now, negative 3 and 9/10 is only 1/10 away from negative 4. It's close, so let's put this close to negative 4. And this will be negative 3 and 9/10. I'll write it in the original decimal form. Next, let's move on to 4, which is positive. So it's to the right of 0. It's right here. After 4, we have 3/8, which is positive. So to the right of 0. And it's going to be in between 0 and 1. Now, 4/8, 4/8, is 1/2. So this is a little less than that, less than 1/2. So let's put 3/8 right here, a little less than 1/2. Next, we have negative 2, which is to the left of 0. It's negative. Negative 2 is right here. Next, we have 3 and 75 hundredths. So let's convert this to fractional form. 75 hundredths, written as a fraction, is 75/100, but we can simplify this. The greatest common factor between 75 and 100 is 25. So let's divide both of these by 25. 75 divided by 25 is 3. 100 divided by 25 is 4. The greatest common factor between 3 and 4 is 1. So we are in simplest form. 0.75 75 hundredths equals 3/4 as a simplified fraction. So this is 3 and 3/4. Anytime you see 0.75, that's going to be 3/4 in fractional form. So 3 and 3/4 is going to be in between 3 and 4. It's greater than 3, but less than 4. More specifically, it's greater than 3.5, but less than 4. It's right in between 3.5 and 4. So let's put 3 and 3/4 right here, or 3 and 75 hundredths. Next, we have negative 15 thirds, so an improper fraction. Let's convert it to a mixed number. We need to divide the numerator, negative 15, by the denominator, 3. So this is going to be negative 5. And we don't have a remainder, so this is just negative 5, which is to the left of 0 and right here on the number line. Now I'll put the original improper fraction. And then lastly, we have 1 and 7/12. So this is in between 1 and 2. Now 1 and 6/12 is 1 and 1/2. So this is greater than 1 and 1/2. Just by 1/12 though, so they are close. Let's put 1 and 7/12 right here. So 1 and 7/12. So again, just greater than 1 and 6/12, which is 1 and 1/2. Now we need to order from greatest to least. So the greatest is going to be the furthest to the right on the number line, and then we can work our way left. So the greatest is 4. Then we have 3 and 75 hundredths. Then 1 and 7/12. Then 3/8. Then -2. Then -3 and 9/10. And then the least is -15 thirds. And now those rational numbers are in order from greatest to least. So there you have it. There's an introductory mini course on rational numbers and number lines. I hope that helped. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, peace.